Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. I want to interact with a video that the world over recently put out, Raymond Arroyo on the world over, which featured Dr. Regis Martin. Um, the video is called Pope Francis in Stopping the Madness. And so there's some criticism here of Pope Francis, and I want to interact with it. I do want to say at the outset, some of the criticism I agree with, and I think it's fair for them to have offered some of it. Whereas some other parts and other criticisms I was very surprised were brought up, and I wanted to interact with them and kind of show to you why I think it's incredible that it was even raised. But yeah, again, at the outset, I want to say that, some of this I'm sympathetic with and I think is legitimate and valid criticisms. I would certainly say that, stopping the madness is something I can get on board with. Yeah, there's some madness going on in the church. And unfortunately, some of that madness could be mitigated by Pope Francis. It really could be. And not just Pope Francis, but also a large group of the bishops. But ultimately, it's at the feet of the Pope. And I do think that Pope Francis could do some things to stop some of the chaos in the church. Not all of it, but some of it. And for one reason or another, he has chosen to take a different approach than what I would suggest. I'll give you an example: the issue with the bishops in Germany. Even though he has released multiple documents condemning what they're doing, I think more needs to be done there with the German bishops. And they're going to bring that up, and rightly so. More needs to be done there, and Pope Francis could do more. I do think at the end of the day, what Pope Francis is probably trying to do is avoid a schism with the German bishops. The problem with that is it really could be that a schism with the German bishops is inevitable at this point, because if they continue to push what they're doing, they will themselves push themselves into schism. So unless they are, really forced to stop, I think they're going to bring a schism on themselves. And what Pope Francis seems to be doing is he's trying to rein them in a way that doesn't create a schism. And I'm just not so sure that that's possible at this point. I kind of question the current policy in dealing with the German bishops. So, I can get on board with that, but there's some other stuff that's brought up here. As we're going to see here in a moment, I'm going to play clips of the video. They bring up the Abu Dhabi document, or the document on human fraternity, and some comments that it made about God wills the plurality of religions. That one was brought up. I was very surprised that was brought up in light of other information that we have about that. And what Pope Francis was saying there. In addition to the comment that Pope Francis said on the Hulu series and Disney series, or actually it was just one video on Hulu and Disney, where he had an interview with some younger folks and talked about all kinds of topics. And at one point he mentions that catechesis on sex is in diapers. And that was also brought up as a criticism of Pope Francis. I was very surprised to see that brought up, and I'll explain why as we get to it. So we're going to take a look at the video and review it here in just a second. So Reason and Theology is growing as a channel. As a result, there's been a number of increases in production costs. So if you're benefiting from R&T, I ask that you consider supporting the channel. You can help out by contributing to the Help R&T Grow fundraiser on GoFundMe. You could also consider becoming a member on Patreon at patreon.com/Reason and Theology, or become a channel member right here on YouTube. With either of these options, Patreon or a YouTube member, you'll get extra access to patron-only content. You can also donate directly to R&T at PayPal if you prefer that option. And you can find links to all of these resources and ways to support R&T in the show description. God bless. All right, so let's go ahead and watch the video. Let me pull it up right now and share it on my screen. Let's watch a few minutes of it together. Let's begin at the very beginning, where Raymond Arroyo is going to give us an introduction to Regis Martin.
With the Synod on Synodality set to begin in just a few months, Moral theology and traditional Catholic teaching on sexuality seem to be under daily assault, even from within the church. Where is the voice of reason upon which the faithful have been able to depend throughout church history?
Throughout church history, I don't know. There's a great deal of parts in church history where we didn't necessarily have a voice of reason, even coming, unfortunately, from Rome. Not necessarily saying in their official promulgations and teachings, but more so in their behavior. Just think the pornography. Was there a whole lot of voice of reason on the church's sexual teachings at the time from the popes? So I don't know about painting church history this way, but okay, let's move forward.
My next guest has been asking just that question. He's the professor of theology at Franciscan University of Steubenville and author of a recent column in Crisis Magazine entitled "Put an End to the Madness." Would you welcome Dr. Regis Martin to the program? Professor Martin, thank you for being here. I want to begin with your recent op-ed in Crisis, where you write jokingly about placing a call to Pope Francis during his Wednesday audience, and you ask him to stop all the madness. In your telling, Francis does take the call. What point were you making by beginning your op-ed that way? What were you attempting to do there?
I remember reading this article, and it seems like a lot of people were confused. Some people thought it was serious, that he was really saying he was the one who called Pope Francis during one of his audiences and pretended to be James Martin. And the Pope immediately answered his call and was eager to talk to him and even interrupt the general audience just to talk to James Martin. And then, Regis Martin says, "Oh no, I'm not actually James Martin. That was just to get through to you, and you need to repent of what you're doing," and blah blah blah. And again, some people took that to be a real claim that he was making, that he really did that, while others kind of took it to be a satire piece. I didn't know. I figured he would comment on it, in a few days after releasing it and kind of tell us which one it was. I appreciate a good piece of satire, as y'all know. um, I found it a little humorous, by way of satire. Not exactly sure that it's fair to Pope Francis, but again, I appreciate satire, and since that's evidently where he was going with it, he was more communicating something by way of satire than actually claiming to bear false witness and call Pope Francis up under false pretenses. Um, that was evidently not the case. So for anybody who was confused and thought that he was really bearing false witness, no, he was engaging in a satire piece.
Well, somebody said that if you don't try to slay your audience, your reader with your first sentence, you might lose them. So I thought maybe I would begin with a spoof, a send up, and it was really a caper. But a lot of people misunderstood and thought that I had, in fact, contacted the Holy Father.
Well, in fairness, whenever I do a satire piece, I'll always put some kind of indication in there that this was satire rather than I'm really saying this. Um, Whereas in his piece, there was no indication that it was satire. So I can understand where some people would get confused, since he didn't leave any kind of Easter eggs. He didn't leave any kind of small print, at the very bottom saying, "Hey, by the way, this is satire." So, I mean, in fairness to those people, I can kind of understand why they got that impression. For me, however, I was skeptical as to whether he was really saying it. Didn't sound like this is something he really did. I didn't believe that it was true. Um, so I just kind of figured, wait a few days, he'll probably come out and say whether this was true or not, or whether it was satire. And here we are.
And if they knew anything about my computer skills, I don't even own a smartphone. I can barely dial my own number. But I thought that would be a good point of entry to sort of electrify the attention of my reader.
Yeah, and again, I appreciate the rhetorical device here. I don't agree with what he's ultimately trying to communicate, and that is that Pope Francis is just so eager to answer James Martin. I not exactly sure that that's the case, but okay.
Yeah, and you write about several problems you see under this pontificate, beginning with the deposit of faith, the depletion of which you say appears to have been programmatic and a programmatic theme of this pontificate from the start. Where do you most see a depletion of the deposit of faith? And why are more of the faithful and even bishops not pushing back against it?
Well, I think there is a twofold crisis that we face. On the one hand, a straight out crisis of faith. People don't know what to believe. There's really no sense of the faith. But then there's a crisis of courage. And I think this afflicts a great many of the bishops and cardinals. They certainly know what the deposit of faith is, but they don't seem able to summon the courage to defend it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, you know, the bishops could be defending the faith way better, including the Pope. I also agree with him as far as people do seem to be uncatechized about the faith, and I would include radical traditionalists in that category. I don't think that they're above that criticism. So I would say both progressive Catholics and radical traditionalists as a whole. I would say, yeah, we have a whole lot of work that needs to be done.
And that I find pretty shocking and really rather unprecedented.
Unprecedented? Really? In church history, it's unprecedented to say that the popes and especially the bishops would be hesitant to correct errors. That's unprecedented in history. Upon what basis? I would say actually it's fairly common, unfortunately, in church history. I hate to say that. Unprecedented, I don't know what's unprecedented here. A lack of catechesis and poor awareness on part of Catholics, that's always been the case. Again, that's not to make light of the issue. And again, bishops and sometimes even popes being hesitant and in fact sometimes cowardly in correcting error. Goodness, when I look at church history, that seems to be a continual problem. And it's a serious problem. I'm not making light of it. But unprecedented? I'm really confused about that comment.
I mean, we have to go back maybe to the 4th century, the crisis of Arianism, to find the same sort of systemic silence.
We have to go that far back? There wasn't things taking place maybe in the 1500s, early 1500s, for instance, and 900s and 1100s and so on. I mean, from the period from the 4th to the 15th century, there wasn't a great deal of cowardice on part of the bishops and sometimes even popes. Again, I'm very confused with this assessment of church history.
In the face of a full-throated assault upon the basic teachings of the church,
which unfortunately we've been dealing with for 2,000 years, both outside the church and within the church.
Yeah. What were the two, if I could get you to focus on the two most egregious departures from traditional teaching and that deposit of faith that really alerted you or alarmed you early on?
So these are the two issues that are at the forefront of Dr. Martin's mind. And there's all kinds of criticisms that could be leveled against Pope Francis, but I was frankly shocked that these were the issues he would bring up.
Were there one or two that you just said, wait a minute, we shouldn't go down this path?
No, a couple of flashpoints. I think initially back in 2016 when he struck the deal with Islam and he conceded that there's a lot of pluralism in the world and that as regards religion, this was somehow God's will. This was his creative intention, part of divine providence, to permit a diversity of religious opinion. Which strikes me as a direct frontal assault upon the centrality of Christ. This downsizes the presence of Christ. He's been relativized. He doesn't seem to be as indispensable as he once was. If we have other equally legitimate voices, and the other flash.
All right, so let's stop there. He's saying that the document presents Jesus as just one among many paths to salvation. Multiple things here. There are all kinds of teachings from Pope Francis where he's very clear about salvation in Jesus and Jesus alone. I have done some shows on those, so I would certainly consider that. But let's just consider the document here itself, isolated from everything else that Pope Francis has said about the unique role of Jesus in salvation. So here we have a doctor of sacred theology who's very confused on what Pope Francis is indicating here. After about, 7 years of this having been clarified by Pope Francis. That's why I'm really scratching my head, because Dr. Martin portrays Pope Francis as indicating that this is willed by God. Like God, actually wants it to be this way, and not just in his permissive will, but in other forms of his will as well. The problem is Pope Francis has already clarified this, and the clarification has been out for 7 years, and it was not even once mentioned by Dr. Martin. When I originally read Pope Francis and what he said here, which we'll look at in a moment, I immediately knew what Pope Francis was saying. Now, I do think that there's still some other criticisms about it, which I'm going to offer. I'm going to offer some criticisms on the human fraternity document, the very same sentence that he's criticizing. I am going to offer some criticisms, but I'm going to do them in light of the clarifications that Pope Francis has offered. But even without the clarifications from Pope Francis, I don't have a, doctorate in sacred theology, and yet I still knew that Pope Francis was talking about the permissive will of God. So maybe you can actually go to St. John Damascene, who talks about different ways in which God wills things. Think of it like this. Let's say there is a judge who is a father, and his son is, arrested for murder, and all of the evidence indicates that his son committed the murder, and his father, as the judge, has to try his son. Has to issue sentence on his son. Now, in one sense, we could certainly say the father, even though he's a judge, he doesn't want his son to go to prison. There's one sense, right? In the sense that ideally, that's not what he wants for his son. But there's another sense in which he does will for his son to go to prison, insofar as maybe we could speak of his permissive will, insofar as the judge says, look, I don't want this for you ultimately, but since you went ahead and did this, I have to go ahead and convict you. And in that sense, he wills it, not in the most ideal sense, but in the sense of, you chose to do this and you're guilty, and I have to justly issue a sentence against you. In that sense, he would will it. So there's a sense in which the judge wants to convict his son, and there's a sense in which he doesn't want to. Well, when it comes to God, ideally, no, God does not want there to be a plurality of religions. He doesn't want any error. He doesn't want any sin. He wants people to follow the truth and follow the one true religion, ideally. But in the sense that God allows free will, and he knows that some people are going to choose error, he permits error, and thus he permits false religions. And only in that sense, in his permissive will, he wills other religions, insofar as he wills people to have free will, and is not stopping them from, not actively stopping them, that is overriding their free will, from following a false religion. Well, Pope Francis again issued this clarification. First of all, let's read what the document itself says, and then I'll read the clarification to you. And then I'm going to offer some criticism of what Pope Francis, what the document says. So again, I do think that some criticism can be leveled here, but what I think that Dr. Martin is doing is he's misplacing the criticism. And I'm shocked that he would actually place the criticism here in light of the fact that this clarification has been available for 7 years. And I have to ask, how is it that a doctor of sacred theology, number one, couldn't think of this distinction? And then number two, wasn't aware of this distinction being employed and clarified by Pope Francis? Those are the two questions that I have. Here's the quote from the human document, or human fraternity document. Freedom is a right of every person. Each individual enjoys the freedom of belief, thought, expression, and actions. And here the freedom is insofar as they're free from coercion. And we could say, of course, within due limits, right? The pluralism and the diversity of religions, color, sex, race, and language are willed by God in his wisdom through which he created human beings. The divine wisdom is the source from which the right to freedom of belief and the freedom to be different derives. Therefore, the fact that people are forced to adhere to a certain religion or culture must be rejected. So he's obviously rejecting forcing people to convert to Catholicism or something like that, and rightly so. As to the imposition of a cultural way of life that, let's see here, others do not accept. Okay, so a couple points here. Notice that he put the pluralism and the diversity of religions being willed by God. Notice he put those in the same category as color, sex, race, and language. That was what was a mistake. I think that was not a good idea, because God wills color, sex, race, and language, a diversity of those, not just with his permissive will, because there's nothing wrong with being a member of this race or color or using this language. So those, God's will towards those things is in a different category than God's will towards religion. And yet in the sentence, they're all just clumped together. And it doesn't kind of tell you, the distinctions here. Now, again, a good theologian is going to know, well, there is a distinction between God willing a plurality of religions only in his permissive will versus the way in which he wills these other things, color, sex, race, and language. So a good theologian is going to say, well, to put it like that is not the best way to phrase it, because you do want to make a distinction between God's will towards religion versus his will towards race and language. So there's a legitimate criticism here of the human fraternity document, and that is it wasn't clear enough. It could be misleading. It should have made that clarification here. Is it necessarily an error and heretical? No, because you could read those distinctions into the document, and you should. But the problem is you shouldn't have to. Whenever the Pope signs a document, he should sign a document that already makes these distinctions for you and is very clear itself and does its best to avoid ambiguity. So there's a legitimate criticism here. Instead of the Pope doing the theological distinctions for you, which I think he should have done, he kind of assumes that you're going to do them yourself. And I don't think that that's a good idea, because many people out there aren't theologians and they're not going to make those distinctions, especially when you're putting things into a category or things that really belong in a different category. You're putting them all into one sentence. The average person is not going to make these theological distinctions. The average person doesn't know distinctions between different kinds of things that God wills, or the different wills of God, if you will. They don't, However, a doctor of sacred theology is something else. A doctor of sacred theology should be aware of these distinctions. Moreover, even if you're not aware of these theological distinctions, I don't know if there's an excuse anymore, given that this clarification by Pope Francis has been available for a good 7 years now. So where's the excuse? I didn't hear from Dr. Martin any indication that he is even aware, because he's mentioned this multiple times in the satire piece and also here. He's brought this up as a criticism of Pope Francis, and in neither case does he bring up the fact that Pope Francis has clarified this, and he's referring to his permissive will. So here's something from Eric Sammons from Crisis Magazine, since we're talking about crisis. A while back, he wrote this. During an Lima visit to, or he wrote ad Lamina visit to Rome after the Abu Dhabi Declaration was released, Schneider asked the pontiff to retract the statement of the interreligious document of Abu Dhabi, which relativizes the uniqueness of faith in Jesus Christ. Bishop Schneider relates that Pope Francis told him that one must explain the phrase in the Abu Dhabi document regarding the diversity of religions in the sense of the permissive will of God. So let me just stop there. So Pope Francis has clarified that particular part. We're referring to the permissive will of God, and that checks out theologically. That should have been the distinction that you would already offer to him as a theologian anyway, but unfortunately many people aren't theologians, so it's understandable that they would misunderstand things, and thus it's right for Pope Francis to offer a clarification for those people, which he did here. However, I am going to criticize the way in which it's done here in just a second. But yeah, he offers this, and this is widely available, widely known. And so I'm very shocked that Dr. Martin brings this up against Pope Francis as a criticism in light of this clarification. My sincere question is, how is he not aware of this clarification on part of Pope Francis? He did say he doesn't really use his cell phone. He doesn't really use the internet and stuff like that. Okay, fair enough. But here's a word of advice. If you're going to go on the world over, or if you're going to write a public piece publicly criticizing Pope Francis, ask maybe one of your friends who can Google things. Ask one of them who has internet access to perhaps see if Pope Francis offered a clarification here. So maybe one of your friends who has access to the internet and knows how to use Google, maybe ask them, has Pope Francis offered any clarifications here? And it would have come up within a 10-second Google search, and thus one would not have made this mistake. So even if one wants to say, well, he doesn't use Google, he doesn't know how to use the internet. Okay, maybe if that, all right, that's fair, but his friends know how to use it, and he knows how to ask his friends. Why wasn't Pope Francis at least given that, benefit of at least asking, hey, was there a clarification here? It wouldn't have been hard to do. Dr. Martin could have called his friend. Takes maybe 10 seconds to take out a cell phone, even if it's like a cell phone that's not a smartphone. Dial a number of a friend who knows how to use Google and ask them, hey, can you Google something real quick for me? Can you search on the internet? It seems inexcusable, in my opinion. Okay, well, let me offer, however, some criticisms here of what Pope Francis is doing here. It continues, though. Let me finish the quote from Eric Sammons. Yet when Bishop Schneider asked in verbal and later in written form, listen to that part, in verbal, for the Pope to make an official public statement to this effect, no public response was given by the Vatican or the Pope. So, first of all, I will say this all relies on the testimony of Schneider. We don't know what the Pope said firsthand. So I'm going to have to take, Schneider at his word that he's speaking of the permissive will of God, but that when Bishop Schneider verbally asked him, presumably at the same time, presumably asked him to, clarify, issue that clarification, like formally, it says that the Pope didn't offer that clarification. But my question is, well, what did the Pope verbally say in response to Schneider? He doesn't tell us that. He says that he verbally and then later in a letter formally requested it. So when it comes to the formal request through the letter for clarification, we didn't get a response. Now, I don't know if Pope Francis even saw that letter. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I don't know. We don't know. But the verbal request, I presume, was there face to face, so Pope Francis would have known of the verbal request if what Schneider is saying is accurate. But my question to Schneider would be, what did Pope Francis say in response verbally to him when he requested that? That's my question. I would just like to know. Did he say something like yes or no? Or whatever it was, I would like to know what he said in response to that. However, he did give him, we do know, according to Schneider, he did give Schneider permission to publish this clarification, to publicly publish this clarification. We do know that from Pope Francis, according to Schneider himself. So Pope Francis was willing through Schneider to clarify this, but then the question is, what did he say to the question of Pope Francis personally doing so through his own channels, through his own outlets? I would like to know. Well, at the very least, Pope Francis, again, permitted it through Schneider. And so this has been available for ages now. So really, people who have access to the internet, or at least have friends who have access to the internet, are without excuse. But I do want to offer some further criticism of Pope Francis here. If Schneider did write a formal request, a written request formally for clarification, two things. Well, if Pope Francis saw that and he did not see fit to formally issue the clarification on his own part himself, I do think that that's a legitimate criticism of Pope Francis. I think he should do that. And if Pope Francis did not see the written letter, well, that's also a criticism of Pope Francis, because why do you have people in charge who aren't showing you these things? That'd be my question. Maybe Pope Francis, you would say, well, maybe he doesn't know that they're not showing him things. I don't know. I don't know, because how are you Pope for this long and not know the people, the character of the people that you have around you? It sort of seems inexcusable at that point. So either way this thing shakes down, I do think that Pope Francis himself should have issued a formal clarification rather than clarifying through Schneider and having Schneider publish this information. Schneider is not going to reach as many people as maybe perhaps Pope Francis could, at least not as visibly. I mean, it's certainly there on the internet, so everybody has access to it and they can access it within 10 seconds. But it would be a lot better if Pope Francis himself did that, because that would initially reach more people than what maybe Schneider could do. So again, there are some legitimate criticisms of Pope Francis here, and also of the document itself. Yes, theologically it checks out. Okay, yes, theologically this isn't heresy, but the average person doesn't know these distinctions, and you shouldn't make the average person reading this document have to be aware of these distinctions. You need to make those distinctions for them. And I'm pretty sure the Muslims would have also agreed with this distinction. So I don't think there would have been a problem to put this distinction in the text itself. It just seems like a failure on part of them to prevent some ambiguity and prevent misunderstandings. Again, there's some legitimate criticism here, but it's misplaced when we hear it from Martin, because he does not tell us that Pope Francis did clarify these things. He just presents it as Pope Francis is effectively denying that salvation is only through Jesus. Again, aside from the fact that Pope Francis has said a million things contrary to that elsewhere, you also do have this clarification. So I think he's ultimately without excuse here. And I want to test something here. So Dr. Martin is implying that Pope Francis is teaching heresy. He's implying it because, Dr. Martin doesn't even seem to be aware of this clarification. So he thinks that it's just, teaching heresy here, and that it's denying that Jesus is the unique way to heaven. So it's somehow teaching pluralism or something like that. Here's a test. Now that he's been corrected, and perhaps somebody can share this with him, let's say once he's become aware that he's been corrected here, my question would be, will Dr. Martin then issue a formal retraction of his criticism here? Will he formally, publicly, and personally retract the misinformation that he spread here, the apologize for the lack of due diligence, apologize for spreading false information when the correct information was easily accessible? Will he apologize for those things and then formally retract them? And then my question is, if not, once he becomes aware that he has done this, and if he's unwilling to do that, then upon what basis can he then criticize Pope Francis? And especially upon what basis can he criticize Pope Francis for not formally himself clarifying himself? I think it's a fair question to ask. Likewise, I would ask that same question to all other public figures who have been saying this about Pope Francis. Perhaps Raymond Arroyo here on the show, who did not correct this. Once Raymond Arroyo becomes aware, and maybe he already is aware of the correction by Schneider, will he publicly apologize? And will he publicly issue a formal retraction? And if not, upon what basis can he then further criticize Pope Francis for being ambiguous or for not clarifying himself? Because at that point, you not only have ambiguity, you have a person who actually knows that they're bearing false witness now. They know that, and they're unwilling to correct that, which would be worse than Pope Francis being theologically sloppy in a document, because now one knows that they're bearing false witness and they refuse to publicly correct it. So I want to offer that test. Let's see if there's going to be a formal retraction on part of Arroyo, Martin, and all others who have been spreading this misinformation once they become aware that this information is out there and they misrepresented the situation. Let's continue. He gives us the second thing that he is very concerned about with Pope Francis, because again, Arroyo asks him for two things, like, what are the two things that stand out to you? And gosh, I can give you way more than two criticisms of Pope Francis, but if I had to boil them down to two things, these wouldn't be the top two for me. They wouldn't even be in the top 10 compared to some other criticisms that I think we could offer of Pope Francis. But okay, let's listen to number 2 for Dr. Martin. Let's see how let's see what he says here.
Point, of course, was in the moral order. That interview that the Pope submitted to, that Disney later picked up and turned into a documentary. A bunch of kids are firing questions at the Vicar of Christ, and of course they're all about sex. And the Pope pretty much gives the game away by saying that the church's catechesis on sex is still in diapers.
He said the church's catechesis on sex is still in diapers. Pay attention. Pay attention. He said the church's catechesis is still in diapers. According to Martin, I'm not saying Pope Francis actually said that. Martin is saying that. Martin is presenting that way. And Arroyo is also complicit in this by not correcting it. Now, I want to note, every single critic that I have seen, every critic of Pope Francis who has brought this up, every single one of them, not one of them has ever actually pulled the video up or read a transcript in context. Maybe they're out there, maybe I just haven't seen it, but the ones that I've seen, not one of them has done that. And I kind of wonder why. I sincerely wonder why. Since that is not available, since people aren't making that available to people, I'm going to pull it up myself. What I did is I'm about to text it or email it to myself so I can pull it up here. And that way I can hopefully show you the video. Otherwise, I'm just going to have to read to you the transcript and play the audio, but I want to try to do the video itself. If I were to pull up the video on Hulu, it blacks it out, unfortunately. And so I didn't have to sit there and read the translation to you. I don't want to do that. So instead, what I did was, yeah, it's probably going to make me, might be too large to share. I might have to end up just playing the audio and then reading the translation to you. Let me try one more thing here. Anyways, I find it fascinating because if you try to show Hulu and play it, it just blacks it out. For some reason, it's able to figure out that like you're showing something on Hulu or Netflix and they black it out. So you have to sit there and just read it and make people listen to the audio, which is in Spanish anyway. So I'm going to try to upload this to Google Drive and then just pull it up here. I'm going to see if that works, because they don't give you the context. And actually what Martin just said is factually false, because again, pay attention. He said the church's catechesis is in diapers. Is that what Pope Francis said? I'm going to show you what he said. And then I'm also going to show to you in context what he said. But let's first listen to the rest of what Martin said while this is also uploading.
Which seemed to me really insulting. I mean, the shade of Aquinas must be shaking to think that.
The shade of Aquinas must be shaking. So, in other words, he sees what Pope Francis said here as a slight against Aquinas. And again, he presents it as the church's teaching.
His moral theology was so infantile that we had to wait another 1,000 years for the kids in California to improve upon it.
And I'm going to show the video, hopefully. And then I'm going to ask, was Pope Francis talking again about the church's catechesis? And number two, did he say anything about Aquinas? Anything about Aquinas? He just presented Pope Francis as presenting this as a diatribe against Aquinas. I'm pulling it up here right now. 1 second. Before I play it though, let's let his clip finish out here. Let's see here. Sorry. Okay. Let's see. I think it kicked out the other video that I was just playing, so let me pull it up again. Let's see, world over. Okay, I'm going to stop my screen and share it again and just finish out that part, and then I'm going to show you the video that I had to record to show you the context, which unfortunately they never give to you. Which I was shocked when this originally came out as a criticism of Pope Francis, because I watched the Hulu series before all of the detractors and critics came out. I watched it and I reviewed it, and I offered the good, bad, and the ugly, some criticisms and some praises. But this one was not a criticism that I had because I remembered the context. And when I saw people bringing this up as a criticism of Pope Francis, despite the context, I just thought, are you kidding me? Really? Wow. So you didn't actually pay attention to the context, did you? And I just kind of dismissed it. All right, these are just people who sloppy and are not, doing due diligence here, or are insincere. One of the two. But then I started noticing more and more people bringing this up, and I thought, gosh, really? None of y'all are reading the context? Not one of y'all? Are we really surprised? And then I started to see Martin with this in the last few days, and of course, he doesn't show you the context. But let's let that part play out.
That as regards religion, this documentary, a bunch of kids are firing questions at the Vicar of Christ, and of course, they're all about sex. And the Pope pretty much gives the game away by saying that the church's catechesis on sex is still in diapers, which seemed to me really insulting. I mean, the shade of Aquinas must be shaking to think that his moral theology was so infantile that we had to wait another 1,000 years for the kids in California to improve upon it. I found that very offensive.
Yeah, no, I think, Dr. Martin, you and I may be the only two people who actually sat through that spectacle. I mean,
and thus both of these gentlemen are culpable for bearing false witness, because by his own admission, he watched it and he didn't correct it. I'm going to show it to you since they didn't do it. Let's see here. Pull it back up. Let's see. Oh, I think I got it. Hold on. Let me play it on a different player here to see if it will show video. Yes. Okay. Success. Now let's see if it actually works when I try to share my screen, or if somehow they figured out how to black the screen out on this one too. Let's see. Okay. Oh, okay. You can see it. All right. Because it's literally me recording my TV. So I figured out a way around uh a way around the problem. Okay, here we go. She says they're talking about masturbation, and one girl was saying this is wrong, another girl was saying it's right. And this lady is saying, well, I just think it's a common thing. And so Pope Francis intervenes and offers his clarification. All right, let's watch.
Yo creo que la gran mayoría ha llegado a su adolescencia y se ha masturbado, ¿no?
All right, so Pope Francis interrupts and he says, at this point, I would like to mention a criterion that will keep us from losing ourselves in some labyrinths. Sex is one of the beautiful things God gave human beings. To express oneself sexually is something rich. Anything that diminishes a true sexual expression diminishes you as well. It renders you partial and diminishes that richness. Sex has a dynamic of its own. It exists for a reason. It's an expression of love. That's probably the core of sexual activity. So anything that drags you away from that, or that pulls it in a different direction, diminishes sexual activity. Now, pay attention. Pay attention to what happens next. He's about to speak about someone in the confessional. So we're talking about a penitent and their understanding of this issue. That's important. You'll see why. He says, sometimes while hearing confession, some people say, I've done something nasty. Sexual things, instead of saying, I handled sexuality poorly. Instead of loving another, I sought myself.
La catechesis sobre el sexo todavía está en pañales.
Catechism, hold on. Missed it. Catechism regarding sex is still at a very early stage. Now, that's the way they translate it. Maybe others are going for more of a formal equivalency. I don't know. And maybe the formal equivalent would be it's in diapers. Maybe that's fine. I mean, perhaps that's what Pope Francis is saying. He's saying catechism regarding sex is still at a very early age. I didn't hear anything about ecclesia in there. I mean, I don't know Italian very well, but I'm pretty sure that some variant of that would be church. Ecclesia, I'm sure some variant of that, something similar, a cognate, would be what church is in Italian. And I didn't hear anything about that in there. So earlier we heard Martin say the church's catechesis is infantile, is in diapers, is at an early stage. I didn't hear anything about church in there. But in fact, what I heard was the context was a person's catechetical knowledge. Who was this person? The person in the confessional. The person in the confessional is expressing a deficient catechetical knowledge of sexuality. And Pope Francis critiques that person in the confessional and says, here is a better understanding of sexuality. And in that context, catechism regarding sex is still at a very early stage. What is he saying? He's not saying the church's catechetical literature is at an early stage. He's not saying the church's catechesis or Aquinas's catechesis. No, he's saying an understanding of catechesis on part of many of these people, especially in the confessional, is at an early stage. That was the context. And I knew that was the context, which is why I was shocked that all these public figures started coming out and throwing Pope Francis under the bus. And I thought, gosh, did any of you actually watch what he said? It's no wonder you're not quoting him in context. It's no wonder you're not either providing the video or transcript. No wonder. Because if you did that, people would then see, wait, he wasn't talking about the church's catechesis. He was talking about the catechetical knowledge of some of these penitents. And in that sense, catechism regarding sex is still at a very early stage. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Not the catechetical literature, but people's knowledge of sex. Yeah. There's a lot of, feet on the ground. There's a lot of Catholics out there that have a great deal of misunderstanding about sex. And they see it as in and of itself intrinsically wrong. Now we say that's ridiculous. I mean, God created sex as a good thing. And you're right, absolutely. And the church teaches that, and that's in our catechetical literature. But there's a lot of people out there who kind of have that impression that somehow the church is saying that sex itself is wrong. And that's not what we're saying. We're just saying it needs to be in the proper context and rightly ordered. That's all we're saying. But some of these people don't understand that. And that's one of the things he's criticizing of this penitent. So my question is, if Arroyo and Martin, according to Arroyo, watched the documentary, how are they without excuse in bearing false witness against Pope Francis? Because they said the church's catechesis, according to Pope Francis, is in diapers. And he did not say the church's catechesis. He was talking in context of a penitent. Let's watch it one more time. I'll actually let the video play out. Let it finish out so you see the rest of the context, which doesn't change anything I said. And then I'll play it one more time and walk you through it again. And then I want to one more time play what Martin said. And that way you can really get to see the difference between what Pope Francis said and what the accusers are saying. I think we Christians haven't always had a mature catechism regarding sex. Oh, that seems to work with my interpretation, doesn't it? Because that's true. There's a great deal of Christians out there who, again, see sex as somehow sex itself is wrong. And that's not true. It just needs to be properly ordered and in the proper context.
No siempre hemos tenido una catequesis madura sobre el sexo. Y es una de las cosas
It's one of the beautiful things God has done.
bellas que hizo Dios.
All right, and then this other lady then wants to change the topic. But let's again play that part again. We're going to watch it again. I'm going to explain it to you play by play. And then we're going to watch what Martin said. Somebody said it works for both interpretations, though. No, it does not. No, it does not. Because in the context, he's talking about a penitent. He is not talking about the church's catechesis itself. He's not talking about the catechetical literature. There's nothing in there that says that. But everything in the context is about the penitent. So no, it does not work for both ways. Upon what basis do you say that? You would have to say he's saying something about the catechetical material itself. He nowhere says that. But he's specifically talking about penitents and their misunderstanding of catechesis. It does not work both ways. And I'm shocked that you could sit here and watch what I just showed you and still say that. Let's watch it again. Maybe you'll get it this time around. To express oneself is sexually rich. Anything that diminishes a true sexual expression diminishes you as well. It renders you partial and it diminishes that richness. Logos Project is saying Christopher West made the exact same point you're making, Michael. Good to know. I have not seen his response to it. Like I said, I have not seen all responses, but the ones that I have seen, they weren't playing the context. Now, if Christopher West put out the context and got it right, great for Christopher West. I haven't seen that. I'm thinking of more other individuals that I have in mind here, including the two gentlemen that I'm reviewing here.
O sea, el sexo tiene su
Sex has a dynamic of its own. It exists for a reason. It's an expression of love.
dinámica, tiene su razón de ser. La expresión del amor es probablemente
That's probably the core of sexual activity.
el punto central de la actividad sexual. Entonces, todo aquello
So anything that drags you away from that,
que te lo tire para otro lado y que te lo saque de esa dirección, te disminuye la
or that pulls it in a different direction, diminishes sexual activity. And here's the part.
actividad sexual. A veces en la confesión,
Sometimes while hearing confessions, some people say. He's not talking about catechetical literature. He's not talking about what we have available as far as resources. He's not talking about the magisterium of the church. He's not talking about Aquinas.
escuchar alguno que te dice, hice
Sometimes while hearing confessions, some people say, I've done something nasty.
cosas feas, ¿no? Y vos son cosas
Sexual things instead of saying, I handled sexuality poorly. So what he's trying to say is that he's trying to indicate that sexual activity itself is not wrong. It's not nasty. It just needs to be in the proper context. And I have a little criticism here because I might ask, well, what exactly are they calling nasty? Because some people could maybe misunderstand what he's saying there. So I would have to get a little bit more context of what Pope Francis is saying, but I know what he's overall trying to communicate. I know his heart here. I know what he's trying to communicate. The context is he's trying to say that sexual activity in and of itself is not wrong or sinful or nasty. It just needs to be in the right context. Otherwise it is disordered and it is wrong. But they're under the impression that somehow in and of itself it is disordered and nasty, and he wants to say no, it's a good thing. It's created by God. It just needs to be in the right context. And in that sense, we do have a lot of work to do. There's just so many people who have that misimpression about what the church teaches.
de sexo, ¿no? En vez de decir, manejé mal mi sexo, que en vez de amarme busqué a mí mismo,
Instead of loving one another, I sought myself.
en vez de esto. O sea, la catequesis sobre el sexo todavía
Catechism regarding sex is still at a very early stage. Let's listen to it one more time.
todavía está en pañales. Creo que los cristianos no siempre hemos tenido una catequesis
I think we haven't always had a mature catechism regarding sex. Let me play it one more time.
todavía está en pañales. Creo que los cristianos no siempre hemos esto. O sea, la catequesis sobre el sexo, que en vez de amarme busqué a mí mismo, en vez de esto. O sea, la catequesis sobre el sexo todavía está
Catechism regarding sex is still at a very early stage. Again, I didn't hear anything in Spanish. I'm sorry, I think I said Italian earlier. No, he was actually speaking in Spanish to my recollection in the documentary. And again, it would be some cognate of ecclesia, I'm sure, in Spanish as well. And so I don't hear any cognate of that in there. I don't hear anything about the church in there. All he's saying, again, is catechism regarding sex is still at a very early stage, or is in diapers, in relation to understandings of catechesis on part of penitents who think that somehow sexuality in and of itself is wrong and nasty. That was the context. How did people not get that? Why is this still an issue? How long has this been out? And they haven't been able to read the context and watch the context and dispel this misinformation at this point? Why is this still being brought up? Again, by gentlemen who claim that they watched the context. So again, my question is, now that it has been pointed out that one is bearing false witness if they repeat this lie, that somehow Pope Francis is attacking the catechetical literature itself, or Thomas Aquinas, now that has been pointed out, and once a person becomes aware of that, let's say Arroyo or Dr. Martin, my question is, will they offer a formal apology and retraction and correction? And if not, upon what basis can they continue to criticize Pope Francis for not doing the same? They don't have any basis at that point. They're no different. In fact, they would be worse. Because in the case of Pope Francis, he may not be clarifying some ambiguities. However, in their case, they would then not be clarifying instances where they have borne false witness. Let's see here. Let me actually go to the video again and play what Martin says. So now that you have the context, you get to see his take on it. And then again, tell me if you think it is a fair take in light of what we've seen. All right. And thank you. I appreciate the clarification here. He said, yeah, the previous context makes your interpretation more accurate. I stand corrected. Thank you. I can deal with people like you who will at least admit, hey, I was wrong. I've been wrong too. I appreciate that. You and I can have a reasonable discussion. But for people who continue to still insist, in spite of all the evidence that, oh no, he's still talking about Aquinas and the church's catechetical literature, I can't do anything. I can't have a productive conversation with such unreasonable people at that point, in spite of the evidence to the contrary. You can't have a rational conversation with somebody who at that point is very clearly intentional in trying to misrepresent Pope Francis for some ulterior motive. All right, let's watch it one more time.
California to improve upon it. I found this was in the moral Christ, this as indispensable as he once was.
And again, remember, these are the top two things for Martin, which I've shown on this show, and really I've even shown elsewhere, the issue with the God wills, the plurality of religions, that these are misplaced criticisms. The top two criticisms that he have are misplaced. What does that say maybe about Regis Martin's analysis of this pontificate?
If we have other equally legitimate voices. And the other flashpoint, of course, was in the moral order. That interview that the Pope submitted to, that Disney later picked up and turned into a documentary. A bunch of kids are firing questions at the Vicar of Christ. And of course, they're all about sex. And the Pope pretty much gives the game away by saying that the church's catechesis on sex is still in diapers, which seemed to me really insulting. I mean, the shade of Aquinas must be shaking to think that his moral theology was so infantile that we had to wait another 1,000 years for the kids in California to improve upon it.
Why strawman Pope Francis like that? Why do that? Where is this coming from? Where is it coming from? It didn't come from what he actually said. So I do have to ask the question, where is this coming from? What's the motives behind this?
I found that very offensive.
Yeah, no, I think, Dr. Martin, you and I may be the only two people who actually sat through that spectacle. I mean,
that's a damning statement. It would have been better if he had not said that, because then we could maybe think that, well, maybe they didn't see the context and they're just negligent. But you can't say they're negligent, because at least Arroyo is saying that he says both of them, but he can only speak for himself unless he knows for a fact that Martin actually watched it. That's a damning statement, because you know better. You know the context. You heard the context. So I had them at that point. It boils down to two things. Since you've seen the context, it either is that one is intentionally trying to misrepresent Pope Francis. That's one option. Or they're not intentionally trying to misinterpret Pope Francis, but they have very poor comprehension skills. It's one of the two. I don't know which one is worse, bearing false witness or having such poor comprehension skills. I'll let you decide which one is worse. But I think those are the only two options at this point for Arroyo and everybody else who has seen the context and still continues to persist with this.
And I forced myself to watch it one night, but I did so alone, so I didn't afflict the rest of the family. But it's kind of shocking.
No, it was actually pretty good. There was a few points in there where it's like, Pope Francis, you could have done better on that, or you could have been stronger on this point, or you clearly don't know what's going on here on the internet with this particular issue, so you don't know what you just commented on. In fairness to him, he doesn't really use social media like that, so okay, but maybe don't comment a whole lot on it when you don't. But so there's a few bloopers in there, but it's like he was, on the whole, pretty solid, and then had some really strong words against abortion and things like that, and against sin. And so he did really well by testifying to the church's teachings in many areas, but in a few areas he could certainly have done better. But it wasn't atrocious as Arroyo is trying to present it.
I mean, you got a woman who does porn, on the side. You got a transgender kid who's kind of hassling the Pope about, why don't you affirm me? It was a very strange and rather bizarre outing. And I don't know why anyone near the Pope would have allowed such a thing,
This kind of criticism I just find odd in light of Jesus and his ministry. Jesus has a conversation with a woman at the well in private, which was already, people are going to find that suspicious, which the apostles did when they returned, seeing and saw that he was talking to a woman alone. They, according to scripture, found that really suspicious. Now, God can do that. And obviously Jesus is without sin there. But he was talking to an adulteress, a woman who was with her fifth husband, and the man that she's with isn't really her husband, so she's in adultery. And you'll notice that Jesus does talk to her and brings that out. And it wasn't a message of Jesus saying, you need to repent of your sins, that converted her, which is perfectly legitimate to say, because Jesus did say that elsewhere. Repent of your sins and believe the gospel. Go and sin no more. Jesus did use that approach in some cases. In other approaches, he just brought out the fact that this is a sin. And he doesn't say, and you need to repent of your sin, which again would have been perfectly legitimate if he did, but he didn't. And she was still convicted. Because she realized that he was clearly a prophet, because he could perceive things about her that were unknown. And she repented and she became a saint. So what Jesus did there, by simply having a conversation with her, he didn't even explicitly call her to repentance. He just had a conversation with her and he spoke the truth about sexuality. And that was enough to convert her. So what is wrong with Pope Francis doing that exact same thing in this documentary? He's speaking to sinners, just as Jesus did. He spoke about the reality of sin, just as Jesus did. And many people were converted from that. Who's to say that some of these people will not be converted from their interaction with Pope Francis, or from people who watch the interaction with Pope Francis? So I find this to be a very odd criticism of Pope Francis. He's saying, why would, the people around the Pope allow this? Couldn't you just say, well, why would the apostles allow Jesus to be alone with this adulteress? Couldn't you say the same thing about the apostles in the New Testament and about Jesus? It's just a very odd, and I would say inconsistent, or at least ignorant criticism. My problem here is, this reminds me of the Pharisees who strain at a gnat while swallowing a camel. You're concerned that Pope Francis had a conversation with sinners about sexuality and very clearly condemned sin. You're concerned about that, but you're not concerned about bearing false witness against the successor of Jesus. Wouldn't that be straining at a gnat but swallowing a camel? Is that not exactly what the Pharisees were doing? I'm just left scratching my head with this part. But then they start to issue some criticisms here that I'll agree with. So let's maybe watch a few minutes of those.
But anyway, the German synodal way has been slow rolling for years, offering things like bishops approving the blessings of same-sex couples, lay preaching during Mass, the possibility of women being ordained, and a request that priestly celibacy be re-examined by the Vatican. Now, you point out that this Pope has done virtually nothing to stop it. Why do you think not? I mean, he did issue, or offices in the Vatican, rather, did issue...
offices in the Vatican with his explicit approbation. We forgot to mention that part. He tries to present it as offices in the Vatican have condemned this, as if Pope Francis was hands-on in them, when in fact Pope Francis has explicitly put his approbation on the condemnation of same-sex blessings.
The rather targeted corrections along the way.
Well, I mean, there are one of two possible explanations. Either there's a want of courage, so we need to put some moral starch into his papal shirt, or he simply doesn't believe anymore. And
Those are not the only two options. Let me give you a third option. It's incredible that a doctor of sacred theology can't think of any third options here. It's an either or here. That's what's blowing me away. I expect this just from some random on Twitter. It's a little different from a doctor of sacred theology. But okay, let me give a third option. Maybe Pope Francis does believe the church teaching here, and maybe he's not a coward. Maybe he is willing to be bold, but maybe he thinks that if he were to take strong measures, such as excommunications against them, that would initiate a schism in Germany, and he doesn't want another Protestant schism and Protestant Reformation, because we haven't been able to heal that schism in 500 years. And he already said, well, we already have the Protestant church in Germany. We don't need another. That's what Pope Francis said. So it's clear that he's worried that they're going to initiate a schism. And frankly, they're certainly pushing for it. So it could be that he isn't a coward. He does believe the church's teachings. He just simply thinks that this is the best way to handle it, to try to talk to them, to bring them back to reality instead of taking harsh measures like excommunication and then creating a schism. Now, I have a criticism of that because I feel like they're creating a schism anyway. So what you're going to have to do one way or another, I think you're going to have to do it. And talking doesn't seem to be working so far with them. That doesn't seem to be working. Maybe he's waiting for the Synod on synodality and hoping that maybe through that they will back down. I am quite certain once that comes, they still won't back down. So you're going to have to do something because they're the ones who are pushing for schism. So I don't necessarily agree with Pope Francis's approach, but I just gave you a third option there without resorting to either one of those rash options there. And my question is, how is it that Dr. Martin couldn't think of a simple third option there? And by the way, there's not only three options. I can think of plenty of others. Those are just three that are mentioned here. I don't know. I'm on board with criticizing Pope Francis for the way he's handling the German bishops. There's criticism there. I'm on board in criticizing German bishops. I do all this. I criticize both Pope Francis and the German bishops in previous videos. I'm just not on board with this either or dichotomy of interpreting Pope Francis in the worst possible way against the evidence and without any evidence. All right, let's continue.
That I think is really frightening. Look, a basic right, which I think every Catholic has, and the violation of that right has been fairly routine in recent years, is the right to remain secure in the possession of one's faith. You ought to know, on the strength of what I believe, that I can summon the courage to confront my persecutors. And they come in all sizes and shapes. I mean, there was a time when the Roman Empire sought to exterminate Christianity. And then in the last century, the Third Reich was bent upon the liquidation of faith. Or maybe it's the local CCD coordinator who flatters herself with the latest fashion in liberal theology. But whatever the source, Catholics, I think, are entitled, as a matter of simple justice, to remain secure, to have a serene sense of what it is I believe, what is permissible Roman Catholic doctrine, and what is beyond the pale.
Yeah, we are entitled to that. And I certainly think that the Pope and the bishops should be the ones backing that up. But let's say they fail due to negligence. You still have the Holy Spirit who's protecting the church from falling into error. So you still have that security ultimately from God. I mean, you see in the Old Testament, God rebuking the shepherds in Jeremiah, saying, okay, well, if you're not going to shepherd my flock, I'll shepherd my flock. If you're not going to be a good pastor, I'll be a pastor to my people, God says. And likewise here, well, okay, if some popes aren't doing the right thing or some bishops aren't doing the right thing, God ultimately is going to do the right thing and ensure the right thing gets done. But I agree, yeah, it shouldn't have to come to that. It shouldn't have to come to God saying, okay, I'm going to have to step in. We should be doing our job to where God shouldn't have to step in. I mean, so there's some fair criticism there. But I almost get the impression as if Dr. Martin thinks that somehow the church is going to be, is going to defect from the faith or something here.
And when hotshot theologians, swashbuckling moralists, decide to blow up the faith and the church's moral tradition, I would hope that the Pope would step into the breach and say, no, you can't do that. That's wrong. Let me unplug that machinery.
Yep. Now that's a legitimate criticism. Let me unplug the machinery rather than making some appointments that just helps that machinery continue to go, or allowing the machinery to continue to go because you're afraid of a schism or whatever. I kind of feel like it's time to pull the plug on the machinery. And that's not necessarily being done in the way that it could be. I think that's a legitimate criticism that Martin is bringing up here. I don't have any critique of that. I'm in agreement with that.
Because it's running amok, and this Pope hasn't done that. And that to me is just inexplicable.
I don't think it's inexplicable. Again, I think that where he's coming from is he wants to prevent a schism. I just think that you're gonna have the schism one way or another if they continue to push it. He's hoping that they're gonna back down when the Synod of Synodality does not approve these things. Well, because at the end of the day, it doesn't even matter what the Synod says, because it's ultimately up to what he says, because the Synod has absolutely zero authority. So ultimately, when the Synod of Synodality doesn't get its way, and Pope Francis doesn't give, some of these bishops what they want, I'm thinking Pope Francis thinks that's going to quiet the German bishops down and that will prevent a schism. And I don't know. They seem pretty hell-bent on moving forward. And so I don't see that changing just because Pope Francis is saying no. Pope Francis already said no, and they're still continuing to push the envelope. So why would it change with a post-apostolic exhortation? I don't think they're going to listen to a post-apostolic exhortation. I think they're going to continue to push the issue. And so you're going to have a schism one way or another. So there needs to be a different way to deal with them. But it seems that Martin just can't think of any other options other than either he's a coward or he believes homosexuality is somehow good or this is all good. It's not an either or. I do have to ask, what drives people's motivations for twisting the Pope so badly like this? I honestly want to know what's the motive here? Is it that people are so dissatisfied with Pope Francis that they jump at any opportunity to accuse him without honestly considering what he said? Is that what it is? Maybe there are some things to be frustrated with Pope Francis about. I think some of that frustration is exaggerated because it's based on misinformation, like what we're getting here. But some of it is not based on misinformation. It's based on legitimate criticisms of Pope Francis and the bishops. And so some of the frustration is understandable. I get it. Maybe not all of it, but some of it is. But then the question is, does that frustration then justify a person to look for any opportunity to jump on Pope Francis? What if they were treated that way? The accusers of Pope Francis, what if they were treated this way? What if somebody came on social media, very, very high profile public figure who has, very large audience, very large reach, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of viewers, and came on and said, Raymond Arroyo and Regis Martin, they deny Jesus's words to Peter in Matthew 16:18 through 19, that upon this rock I'll build my church. They deny the papacy. And some people will be like, what? They deny the papacy? What? They deny Jesus's words? What are you talking about? Yeah. See, they didn't believe Pope Francis. They didn't believe Pope Francis in this interview. They didn't believe what he said there. Okay, but that doesn't translate into denying Matthew 16 or even the papacy, because what the Pope says in a private interview isn't even magisterial. So it's not like a denial of the papacy itself or even of any papal teachings. You see what I'm doing here, though? I'm offering distinctions and I'm being charitable to Raymond Arroyo, and I'm actually looking at them in context, and I'm considering that their criticisms of Pope Francis is not a criticism of papal teaching itself, at least here. And so I'm being charitable, I'm being fair to Raymond Arroyo, I'm looking at them in context. But if somebody did what they just did to Pope Francis, if somebody did that to them, rip them out of context, say, see, they don't believe the vicar of Christ, therefore they don't believe the one who sent the vicar of Christ, which is Christ Jesus. And we know who sent Jesus. It was the Father who sent Jesus. Therefore, Raymond Arroyo and Regis Martin don't believe God the Father. They've denied the Trinity. They've denied. If somebody were to come with these ridiculous and rash conclusions, you would say that's not being fair to Raymond Arroyo. That doesn't even follow from what they're saying. You're being rash. You're not looking at them in context. And you would be right to point that out. You would be right to correct such a person who rashly judges Raymond Arroyo and Regis Martin that way. You would be right to do that because that's true. Nothing that they said in that interview, or at least in that part of the interview, leads to what I just said. But that's what they're doing to Pope Francis. And I have to ask why, when they wouldn't want to be treated that way, why is it they're so quick to do that to him? I don't get that. I don't understand it, other than what's going on here is people are very frustrated with Pope Francis, and they're looking for something to accuse him of. It reminds me of what they did to Jesus. Some of the Pharisees behaved exactly like this, straining at a gnat while swallowing a camel. You're upset with what Pope Francis said about catechesis when you took it out of context, but you completely neglect schismatic content. You completely neglect bearing false witness and things like that. Again, straining at a gnat while swallowing the camel. The Pharisees did not like what Jesus was saying because Jesus was rightly condemning them in their behavior. And so what did they do? Well, they looked for some kind of excuse to convict Jesus. They looked for something, you're a blasphemer. Oh, you're claiming to be the Son of Man? Blasphemy. So they were looking for some kind of excuse to condemn him, not because they were honestly evaluating his teachings, but because they hated him because he convicted them of their sins and of their wrongdoings. That's exactly what seems to be going on here. Some of these radical traditionalists are being called out by Pope Francis. They're being convicted of their sin. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear that their radical traditionalism is going too far. They don't want to hear the disciplinary measures that he's taken against them. They don't like it. And so they're looking for something to accuse him of. It's an interesting parallel that I think should be considered. And that's the only one I could honestly come up with to try to explain why people treat Pope Francis this way. I can't think of any other reason. It can't be that they're just negligent when, according to their own admission, they saw the context. So it can't be negligence. Maybe it's just poor critical thinking skills. I don't know which is worse. Behaving like a Pharisee or poor critical thinking skills. I don't know. But I'm just trying to think of options here to explain the phenomenon that we just witnessed. So please keep this in mind whenever you go to online sources and you want to consider what they have to say about Pope Francis or anything else. Ask, okay, is this really a reliable source? Do they have strong comprehension skills? Or have they shown that maybe they don't in the past? Or are they just looking for something to convict Pope Francis about? Or are they honestly trying to evaluate Pope Francis consistently and honestly? Ask those questions when you turn on social media and start listening to some of these voices. I think we really need to start doing that with the vast majority of what we're being exposed to on social media, because I'm seeing this over and over. Anyways, I hope this was helpful. If so, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Also, check me out, patreon.com/reason and theology if you want to support me. We'll see you later. Hey, pro-lifers, I want to remind you about realestateforlife.org. If you want to support the pro-life movement at no cost to you in the process of buying a home or selling a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, check out realestateforlife.org for more information. God bless. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button. See you next time. God bless. Hey, everybody. Just wanted to tell you about my new free ebook, Church Chaos, Biblical Insights for Confused Catholics. If you are a confused Catholic and you're thinking about leaving the Catholic Church, or you're thinking about converting to the church, but you see that there's a crisis in the church and you're just unsure, this is the book for you. Again, it is free. Just simply go to reasonandtheology.com. You'll see a pop-up that comes up on your screen. Just simply click on it and you'll put in your email and it will provide you the free PDF ebook right then and there. Please check it out if you're confused about the situation in the Catholic Church today. reasonandtheology.com.